All right, so let's look at problem number 6 here, which is kind of where the problems start to get a bit difficult. So what we're trying to look at here, what this question really is designed to do, is to try and understand what or how we derive the output supply curve. And so if we really understand how we derive the output supply curve, it helps us understand or recall what types of things are going to shift it around, and that's going to help us understand the answers to lots of the other questions, and it helps us analyze the events that we see happening around us. So in this question, we're trying to figure out, okay, well, what affects the shape of the output supply curve? And we've got two different options here. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm just going to start with kind of a brief reminder of how did we get the output supply curve. So how did we derive the output supply curve? We started with a labor market. So we have employment N on the horizontal axis. We have the real wage W on the vertical axis. And we had labor demand and labor supply. So here's labor supply. And really the key part here when we started going to output supply was to recall that labor supply was affected by the real interest rate. And we'll kind of come back to what was going on there. And we have labor demand here. And we're going to start with N1 and W1. So for the purposes of driving output supply, the changes in the real wage don't in particular matter. And so what we did then was we said, okay, for this real interest rate, R1, we get some employment. And I can take that level of employment to my production function. And given that level of employment, I know exactly then how much output we have, Y1. So that gives me a combination of a real interest rate and a level of real GDP, which if we bring over here then, to real GDP on the horizontal axis, the real interest rate R on the vertical axis, I have 1 point. R1 Y1. And then when we derive the output supply curve, the idea was we're going to change the real interest rate and see how that changes the level of output supplied by firms. And so let's say that R1 goes up to R2. So the real interest rate is going to increase to R2 here. And our question is, what happens to the level of real GDP or output supplied by firms? So remember, when the real interest rate goes up, that's going to increase labor supply or shift it to the right. So the idea, and you can kind of go back through our notes to understand where this came from. The idea is that as the real interest rate goes up, think of yourselves as students. I don't want to take out as many student loans. The real interest rate is the rate of interest I'm going to pay on my student loans. I don't want to take as many student loans out. The only way that that's going to work for me to take out fewer loans is for me to work more. So when the real interest rate goes up, my response is going to be, I'm going to spend more time working in order to borrow less or to take advantage of the higher interest rate and save more. So the effect here is that labor supply is going to the right, and so that increases the level of employment, which increases the amount of real GDP supplied by firms or produced by firms. And so as we keep changing that real interest rate, we see that the amount of GDP supplied by firms is going to fluctuate around as labor supply is changing. So it's all driven by changes in labor supply. So now back to our question. We were asked in number 6 to figure out what affects the slope of that output supply curve, right? So is it going to be really steep, or is it going to be more flat, like that? And we've got a couple of different options to explore, and so this kind of helps us remember what exactly is going on. So in the first part, number 6, part A, one of the options we had was, well, what if the marginal product of labor changes with labor in different ways? So we had MPN decreases with N quickly or slowly. Those were our two options. And so this is kind of a nice question because it helps us remember, well, what does the marginal product of labor affect in this model? And the answer is it affects labor demand. So what we're going to have here we have our labor market, and we're going to have two possible different labor demand curves. So we're going to have one where the marginal product of labor is decreasing quickly with N. So remember, labor demand is determined entirely by the marginal product of labor. So if you go way back into chapter 4, we figured out, okay, how many workers does the firm want to hire? What we determined is that labor demand comes entirely from the marginal product of labor. That labor demand curve is exactly this, and as N increases, the marginal product of labor goes down. That's diminishing marginal product of labor. So the faster that happens, the faster diminishing returns occur, the steeper that labor demand curve is going to get. As N increases here, we see that the marginal product of labor, or labor demand, is decreasing, and it's happening very quickly in this example. So I'm going to call this NDF for it's fast. Marginal product of labor decreases quickly. And it's slow this would be labor demand slow. So the marginal product of labor is decreasing there as N increases, but just not nearly as fast. Okay, so what does that have to do with output supply? Well, let's draw a labor supply curve here where they start in the same place at R1. So when we have R1 here, we're going to get the same derivation of output supply. I've got my production function down here. Here's N1. Here's Y1, and we take it over to deriving output supply. And at R1, we have exactly the same Y1 in both cases. Now, what happens when R goes up to R2? Where do we end up in each of the two cases? Well, let's shift labor supply. NS of R2. So labor supply is shifted to the right now. And let's see, okay, where are we in each of the two cases? So let's start with the fast decrease in labor, marginal product of labor. We see that I'm going to call this N2F for N2 fast. And what we see is that, yes, we get the increase in Y, but it's a relatively small increase in Y. So when we increased R, we did get an increase in Y, but it was pretty small. So I'm going to call this Y2F. So when the marginal product of labor is decreasing quickly, as R increases, the change in Y is going to be relatively small. So if we kind of draw our output supply in this case, YSF for YS, with the fast changing marginal product of labor. Now in the slow case, we get a much bigger change, and S2 is a much bigger increase in employment when labor supply changes. So we bring this down, and slow 2, and we get Y slow 2 is a much bigger increase in Y. And so now if I was to plot my output supply, it's going to be much flatter. YSS, output supply, when we have a slow changing marginal product of labor. So output supply is going to be steeper when the labor demand curve is steeper, because we get smaller changes in output in response to a given change in the real interest rate, because employment doesn't change as much. Labor demand is more inelastic in that case. And so that helps us understand then where some of this information is coming from. So we have to go back to how do we derive output supply and really get into the details here. Now this is obviously a relatively difficult problem. And the reason I assigned it is that if you can handle this, you're going to understand where output supply curve comes from much better than if we ignored these types of problems. And once you understand where we get the output supply curve from, you can respond to changes in our environment, which we have coming later, much better than if you didn't know this information. So let me kind of go back here to our question. And I'll probably I'll stop here and make another video. This one's getting a bit long to go through part B of this answer.